Welcome back to the Sutliff and Stout Legal Podcast. I'm Abby, and as always, I'm here with Hank Stout from Sutliff and Stout Injury and Accident Law Firm. Today, we're going to be getting into something that can make or break car accident cases here in Houston, the evidence. Most people think of the police report as just a piece of paper, but according to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, there are over 6 million police-reported crashes in the United States every year. And here in Harris County, the quality of that report and the evidence backing it up often determines whether someone gets fair compensation through the District Court of Harris County or walks away with nothing. We are going to break down every type of evidence that matters, so police reports filed with the Houston Police Department or the Texas Department of Public Safety, photographs, witness statements, video footage, medical records, expert testimony, and how it all comes together in Texas civil court cases. Hank, you have built a lot of cases on evidence right here in Houston. Before we get into the specifics, what is the single biggest evidence mistake you see people make after a car accident in Houston?
The biggest mistake that I see from an evidentiary standpoint is failure to document what everything looks like. And what I mean by that is that you take pictures of the damage to your car and the other person's car, but you forget to take pictures of where the cars are on the roadway, and then having a little bit more perspective, maybe a little bit further away so you can see distances and things of that nature and kind of exact the location. Because if you take the picture too close, then what happens is you see the damage on the vehicle. Well, that's not hard to see, but you actually don't see which lane the vehicle is in, which lane the other vehicle is in, so that you can help the jury understand why the other person is at fault and what they should have done based on the rules of the road.
So let's start with the document that anchors almost every car accident case here in Harris County. The FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program and the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety both track crash data nationally. And every one of those data points starts with a report filed by a responding officer, whether that is the Houston Police Department or on city streets or the Texas Department of Public Safety on highways. Why is the police accident report often one of the most important documents in a car accident claim in Houston?
Sure. So the crash report is a great document to use because it gives both sides a little bit of information about who was involved, what happened, what insurance companies are involved. Typically, they'll list out witnesses if the officer can identify those witnesses. So it's a very helpful document that's created by the responding officer to indicate essentially what his or her assessment was of the collision at the time that they showed up.
So the police report is not just paperwork, it's foundation that the insurance company and Harris County Court build analysis on. How soon after the accident does someone need to make sure a report gets filed?
Sure. So you generally want to contact the police and fill out a report. It takes, unfortunately, in Harris County, sometimes it'll take a while for the police to show up. If that's the case, you can always file a green form that provides the information of what occurred. While the crash report is an important document that everybody looks to, oftentimes when you actually get to court, it's not necessarily the definitive document because the officer's opinion about who was there and what they said is very much admissible. His or her opinions about what happened may or may not be admissible depending on the officer's experience, the type of recreation they did. I mean, it gets a little more technical there, but as a general starting point, it's a great document that kind of tells you who, what, where, when, and why. And then that allows the lawyer to then expand upon that to make sure that, we have all the evidence that we need.
And most people have never actually read a police accident report before their own crash. The Texas Department of Public Safety and Houston Police Department use standardized forms, but there is a lot more in the report than most people realize. So what information is typically included in a police accident report filed in Houston that can affect compensation claims?
Sure. So the things that I look for as a lawyer when I look at a report is who is involved, what insurance companies are involved. The narrative is also helpful because that's where the officer kind of gives his opinions as to what he thinks occurred. And then also the causes or the contributing factors is the way they describe it to the collision. And so they're not saying who caused the collision. They're just saying who they feel like contributed to the collision. And so that's all done by numbers. So you take those numbers and you look at the standardized code sheet, and then you can kind of assess, was it a failure to yield the right of way? Was it failure to stop? Was it excessive speed? Was it distraction? So all that's very helpful to determine, what the officer found when they arrived at the scene.
So then the report is filed and the insurance company gets a copy. This is where a lot of people lose control over their claim without realizing it. The Texas Department of Insurance regulates how insurers handle claims in this state, but the adjusters have a playbook. So how do insurance companies use police reports when evaluating car accident claims here in Texas?
Sure. So generally, an insurance company, they too realize that a police report, while a valuable piece of evidence, is not definitive as to what occurred. They know that most officers who fill out those police reports aren't technically qualified to be experts. And so a lot of insurance companies, if the police report's good for them, they'll talk about how great the police report is. And then if the police report is bad for them, they'll still try to say, well, and find other reasons why you may or may not be somewhat at fault for the collision. And so generally they'll try to use it to their advantage, whether it's good or bad for them. And so you just need to have your own lawyer that can look at it and articulate the reasons why you weren't at fault and why the other person was.
And if the police report is vague or incomplete, maybe the officer arrived late and didn't see much, does the insurer use that against the person filing the claim?
Sure. So yes and no, right? I mean, so the insurance company is going to advocate for their insured and want to pay as little on a claim as possible. And so if they want to argue that the police report doesn't contain certain things or, is not necessarily conclusive as to an issue, they have a right to do that. Just like you as an injured person have a right to argue that the officer got it wrong. It all just depends on, the facts of the case. And that's why it's so important to document the scene when you're there, right? The pictures taken right after the collision of where the vehicles are before they're moved, to the extent you can do that safely, is really, to me, the best piece of evidence, because the crash report is important. But if you have a photograph that directly contradicts what the report is saying, then the photograph to me is more compelling than the police report, because you have a piece of physical evidence that shows the location of the vehicles. And so you can prove why you weren't at fault.
So then this is something that people argue about constantly, but the responding officer from the Houston Police Department or Texas Department of Public Safety writes down their opinion about who caused the crash. Sometimes they issue a Texas Transportation Code citation right there at the scene, but can a police officer's opinion about who was at fault actually influence a car accident lawsuit here in Harris County?
It's the easiest form of documentation that insurance companies and lawyers have to argue about who's at fault. It's an independent third party that's kind of looking at it. They don't really have a vested interest. And so they're giving their assessment. And so it is an absolutely helpful piece of evidence, and the officer's opinions are valuable in assessing what has happened. I just want people to understand that it's not the final say-so, meaning, there's ways to argue, and sometimes officers get it wrong. And so there's different ways to come about a case as to who's at fault.
So if the officer gets it wrong, maybe if they arrived after the fact and only heard one side of the story, how hard is it to overcome that fault opinion in Harris County Court?
That's a great question, Abby. And it's not hard to overcome an officer's assessment if you have the right evidence, right? If you have photographic evidence of where the vehicles are located, if you have video of where the vehicles are located, let's say you have dash cam that the officer didn't have access to that shows that somebody, sped in front of you and then slammed on the brakes. That's all great evidence to suggest that, the other person is at fault. And so if you've been involved in a collision and you disagree with the officer and you have, evidence to suggest that the officer got it wrong, well, then, a lawyer just needs to take a look at that so that they can assess it for themselves and try to help you see if there's a way to try to convince the insurance company that the officer got it wrong.
Thank you. Okay, we have covered why the police report is so critical here in Houston and what is in it, how insurance companies use it, and what the officer's fault opinion really means under Texas law. But the police report is just the starting point. Now let's talk about the evidence you gather, photos, witnesses, video, the pieces that can make a weak report strong or strong report even stronger. And I know you've touched a little bit on all of this, so we're going to get a little deeper. So before we move into the evidence you gather on your own, let's address something that happens more than people think: mistakes in the report. The officer is human. They are documenting a chaotic scene on a Houston street or a busy Harris County highway, sometimes in the dark or in the rain, and errors happen. So what should drivers do if they notice an error in the police accident report?
Sure. So depending on what the error is, you can just reach out to the officer and ask him to amend his report. There's a process that all these officers go through when they draft the report, and their supervisors look at it, and then it's published into the public database. But if there are mistakes, and we've had occasions where we reach out to the officer, we point out what we think the inaccuracy is, and oftentimes they'll change their report if you can show them why, right? I mean, they're not going to just change it because you disagree with them, but if you can articulate to the officer in very clear terms what's not accurate, then they want to get it. I mean, for the most part, they want to get it right. And so they'll change their report.
How often do you see cases in Houston where an error in the police report almost costs someone their entire claim? Is this common enough that everyone should double check their report?
You should definitely check the report, right? And most of my clients do. And sometimes there's little errors. And I tell my clients that's not worth it because it doesn't necessarily affect the liability determination. But I mean, if there's inaccuracies on the liability determination, if an officer has you heading east and coming from a different direction and somehow blames you for it because of the direction you're coming from, well, I mean, that's a pretty big mistake. And so you want to point out to the officer that, hey, that's not accurate and this is what actually happened. And so it doesn't affect the outcome of the case. It just affects how quickly you can get to the outcome of the case. Because once you get a lawyer involved that can articulate what actually happened, you have a right to then file a lawsuit. You don't have to accept the officer's opinion, and then you can demonstrate why you weren't at fault. It just makes the process more difficult when the officer's opinion disagrees with what you're trying to say. And so the insurance company will then rely on the police report that's favorable, even though it may be inaccurate. And so you just have to find the right lawyer who will advocate on your behalf to make sure that the truth is known and that the facts are clearly established that you didn't do something.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining that to us. So now let's talk about the evidence that people can control: your phone in your pocket. The scene is right in front of you, maybe at an intersection in Houston, maybe on Interstate 10, Interstate 45, and the 610 loop. Most people take a few photos, but they miss the ones that actually matter. So I know you've touched on this a bit, but how important are photographs from the accident scene when building a compensation case?
So they're incredibly important. And the more perspective you can give someone as to where the vehicles were, the positioning on the roadway, where they were in relation to other landmarks, the better the pictures are going to be. It's great that you have 20 pictures of the damage to your vehicle and the damage to the other person's vehicle. But if you don't have any pictures of where the vehicles were on the roadway, then you really haven't done yourself any favors. And so what I recommend to people is try to step back by 30, 40 feet and then start taking pictures in all directions. From behind you where the accident happened, in front of you where the accident was, to the left and to the right, and then some with the vehicles in it, some without. Photographs of kind of where everything was positioned on the roadway are super helpful because it allows someone like me or an accident reconstructionist to come in and look at it and then recreate the accident in a scientific way to try to determine what happened. Because what officers do is completely different than what an accident reconstructionist does. An officer, all he's looking for is he'll come in there, look at it. Based on the rules of the road, he'll make an assessment of who he thinks are the contributing factors to the collision. Whereas an accident reconstructionist will come and place the vehicles where they were. He'll look at speeds, he'll look at the direction of vehicles, and then recreate the collision to allow the jury to kind of see what happened so then they can make a decision for themselves as to who they think was at fault for the collision.
And then people always ask about this, but does it matter what quality the photos are? Like if someone just has a blurry phone photo from a rainy night on Interstate 10, are those still useful in court?
Any evidence is good evidence, right? I mean, so any photographs are good photographs. Obviously, I would prefer clear photographs that clearly depict where everyone was. Same thing with video and other things. And so, but I mean, oftentimes you can't control that, but to the extent that you can get in focus photographs, that's going to be more helpful. Also video, right? I mean, and if you're going to do a video, again, you want to give it perspective. So you want to come out and then come in, look around so you can see the entire area. Only do that though if it could be done safely, right? If you're on a Houston roadway or on a highway, you're on I-10 or 59 or 45, you don't want to get out in the middle of the freeway and start trying to take those pictures, because unfortunately, a lot of accidents happen while your car is in the middle of the freeway because people aren't paying attention. So you want to make sure that whatever you do it safely.
That's a good point. And then photos capture the aftermath, but witnesses capture what actually happened. So a neutral third party who saw the crash from the sidewalk or from another vehicle on Houston streets can change the entire direction of a case. Why do witness statements often play a major role in proving liability in car accident lawsuits here in Texas?
Sure. Witnesses to collisions are super helpful because they are, generally independent, non-biased third parties that are kind of telling what they saw. And that's super helpful because a jury is trying to be fair, right? A jury is trying to determine who they think did what and who's at fault. And so hearing from third parties who don't really have a dog in the fight, it's always helpful to kind of understand and give perspective to what occurred. Oftentimes there isn't video of a collision, there isn't any surveillance footage. And so, the people who saw what happened are the only kind of neutral third parties that can provide evidence as to what actually occurred, because oftentimes stories differ and people will say things, even though it's not true, about who did what. And so having a third party come in and talk about it is super helpful.
And we are in an era where cameras are everywhere: dash cams, traffic cameras, business surveillance systems, doorbell cameras on homes. So the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Houston Police Department are increasingly using their own body cameras and cruiser cameras at accident scenes. How can video evidence like dash cams, surveillance footage impact accident claims here in Houston?
What I find to be the most helpful, besides dash cam footage from an actual vehicle involved in the collision, is body cam footage. Most officers now will carry body cams. And whenever they go in to investigate a collision, they'll turn their body cam on. And where that can be helpful is that generally an officer is going to speak to the parties involved in the collision. And so what's super helpful is oftentimes the officer doesn't write down verbatim what a person says occurred. And so, but the body cam captures exactly what they said. And that is a great source of evidence that we use to then make sure that people stick to the story that they originally gave, not the story that the insurance company wants them to tell or that their new defense lawyer friend has told them that they should tell. Rather, it's the story that they told the officer right after it happened.
Okay, we have covered what happened at the scene. Now let's talk about what happened to the person. The American College of Emergency Physicians recommends that anyone involved in a motor vehicle crash be evaluated, even if they feel fine. And here in Houston, you have facilities like Houston Methodist Hospital and Memorial Hermann Texas Medical Center nearby. What role does medical evidence play in proving injuries in a car accident case?
That's a great question, Abby, because every case, there's kind of really two big things you focus on, like who's at fault and then what are the damages, right? And so in terms of damages, the best piece of evidence that you can get are medical records that talk about what happened, right? And the proximity of those medical records to when the collision occurred is very important, because oftentimes if you wait to go to the doctor for a month because you're hoping it gets better, the insurance company is going to argue, well, you're not really injured. And, if you were really hurt, you would have gone to the doctor and you're just making these things up, right? When the truth is that you were just trying to see if the pain would go away. And so I always encourage people to go get checked out and tell the doctor what hurts and what doesn't hurt. You always want to be truthful about your pain, but also too, it's not the time to just suck it up and not complain. If something's hurting, then you need to articulate it so that it gets included in the medical records, because one of the defense arguments that they like to make is, unless it's specifically stated in the ER records, then they say the injury never happened, which that's not fair either, because oftentimes your neck may be hurting, but you have a broken foot. The neck pain is so bad that you're not really noticing your foot, but then the neck pain goes away and your foot pain's still there. Well, they all happen because of the accident. It's just your brain can only process so much. And so, trying to be as descriptive as possible in your medical records is super important. And then getting treated early for your injuries is super important as well.
All right, we have covered the evidence you gather yourself here in Houston, photos, witnesses, video, medical records. Those are all the building blocks. But now let's talk about the heavyweight evidence, the experts, the reconstruction, and the technical analysis that separates strong cases from cases that settle for nothing in Harris County. So this is where the legal strategy gets sophisticated. Expert witnesses are not people who saw the accidents. They are professionals brought in to analyze the evidence and explain what it means to a jury at the District Court of Harris County. The American Association for Justice and the State Bar of Texas both emphasize the importance of qualified experts in personal injury litigation. How do lawyers use expert witnesses to strengthen accident compensation cases here in Texas?
That's a great question, Abby. And so a lot of cases are lost or won based on the experts you hire, right? And because sometimes it's a he said, she said. In cases of wrongful death, a party may be dead, so there's only one person who's giving their side of the story. And oftentimes the at fault in that circumstance who's alive is not telling the truth because they don't want to be held accountable for what they did. And so these experts, especially accident reconstructionists, can come in, analyze the evidence. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence that we collect after a collision. So after a collision, an expert will go to the scene. They have a laser surveyor that will essentially document the scene comprehensively. We'll do the same with the vehicles so that we can put the vehicles on the roadway. We can look at the damage, where they would have come from to see if things match up. There's black box data or ECM data, electronic control module that you'll get out of vehicles that talk about speed and delta V and various things that are very important in a collision. They also say, do you have your seatbelt on? I mean, it has all of this different information that's available. Same thing with like commercial vehicles. There's you can download the engine. You can see how fast they were going. You can see how much percentage they were on the accelerator. And so you put all that evidence into, or you kind of gather it all up and you put it in a package, and then you can actually recreate what actually occurred to scale. And so that helps the jury understand, well, okay, this is what happened. And this is based on the evidence. What the driver's saying is impossible. Like it couldn't have happened the way he's saying it happened because, his vehicle is saying that he was going much faster than he's indicating. And so that's why, an accident reconstructionist is super helpful. But same thing, all types of experts can be super helpful, because not only do you need experts to help explain who's at fault, but you also use experts to explain what the damages are and how they're going to impact a person's life, how it's going to affect their activities of daily living, their quality of life. All of those things are super important because the jury has to assess what happened and how it will affect the person.
And the damage on the vehicles tells its own story. So the NHTSA and the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety have decades of crash test data showing how vehicles deform under different impact scenarios. How can vehicle damage reports help determine who caused the accident here in Houston?
Sure. So a vehicle damage report, so in the police report, the officer will document generally what parts of the vehicle were damaged, which that's helpful, right? I mean, if you have, depending on how the damage to both vehicles, that kind of tells you what happened. When you start doing what's called crush analysis is what, when they do these test dummies and test to do all that stuff, what they're looking at is crash analysis, right? So the crash analysis, or crush analysis is another way to refer to it. You're looking at how much the crush occurred. And so then you're trying to determine scientifically what the impact speeds would have been, because that then tells you the forces generally that may or may not have been applied to the occupant of the vehicle. So in low impact cases, one of the arguments is, well, the forces involved in that collision could have caused this. And so, those are all things that you have to consider. And then when you do consider those things, you have to, as a lawyer, figure out, well, does this make sense or doesn't it make sense? And so you have to look at other information as well, like what was the person's history? Did they have any prior problems? All of those things to determine what damages were actually caused by what collision.
And when the responding officer issues a citation at the scene, like a speeding ticket, failure to yield, running a red light, that citation becomes part of the evidence file. The Texas Department of Motor Vehicles records the violation, and it can follow the at-fault driver into your Harris County civil court case. Do traffic violations documented at the scene strengthen a compensation claim?
That's a good question, Abby. So it's kind of an intersection between civil law and criminal law. And so if an at-fault pleads guilty to failure to yield the right of way or running the red light, then that guilty plea is admissible. But oftentimes they do not plead guilty. They plead no contest or not guilty. And so if they plead no contest or not guilty and then take probation, and so that it's not a permanent guilty finding, well, then the ticket itself is not actually admissible. The assessment of the officer about running the red light, that may or may not come in depending on the evidence and the sign. How did the officer arrive at that conclusion, right? So that's where the intersection of criminal law and civil law meet. And then when you go back to why you get an accident reconstructionist, is because oftentimes the police officer is not qualified to provide an accident reconstructionist opinion in a court of law, or at least in the civil context. And so that's why you would get an accident reconstructionist. And so that's an interesting intersection where sometimes it can be helpful just in general, but if you actually go to trial, then a judge will do an assessment of whether or not the officer is qualified to give the opinions that he's giving. And then that will make the determination if those opinions are admissible.
Okay. So we talked about medical evidence proving injuries happened. Now let's talk about medical evidence proving what those injuries cost. The American Medical Association sets billing and coding standards that hospitals follow, and those records become the financial backbone of a compensation claim. What role do medical bills and treatment records play in determining compensation amounts?
Well, that's a great question, Abby. So in a personal injury lawsuit, a person has a right to recover for the harms and losses caused. And one element of damages that you'll see is what is the reasonable cost of past medical treatment and what is the cost of future medical treatment. And so your injuries will determine what type of medical treatment you need. And so depending on what those injuries are, you could need a life care plan. You could need all types of things that kind of look into the future and say, okay, you need a back surgery now, but you're 30 and you need a low back surgery and you work in a manual labor job. And so you're going to have extra stress on your back. And so in about 20 years, you're going to need another surgery because you've lost the cushion associated with your spine because you had to have it fused. I mean, so there's a whole litany of things you have to look at, and the medical records will determine, kind of provide you a baseline of what the injuries are. And then you can go out to various medical experts and talk to them. Okay, well, if you have these injuries, help us look long-term into the next 30, 40 years. What is the person going to need in terms of medical treatment? That's future surgeries, assistive devices, medicine. What does the person need to help them as a result of the injuries that they sustained? And the law allows you to recover money for that future treatment. And so that's where it kind of all comes together. And that's where you really need a lawyer that understands the process and that has the resources to get the right experts to help the jury understand what your harms and losses are as a result of a collision.
All right, we have covered the full evidence toolkit. Now let's talk about how it all comes together here in Houston, how lawyers build a case from these pieces, how insurers fight back, and what makes the difference between settling fast and going to trial in District Court of Harris County. So building a car accident case is not about having one perfect piece it is about layering multiple types of evidence until the picture is undeniable. The American Association for Justice and the State Bar of Texas both pub litigation resources on evidence strategy. How do lawyers combine multiple types of evidence to build a strong accident lawsuit?
Sure. So again, as a lawyer, I break it down into you have liability evidence and then you have damage evidence. And so for a liability, you're going to gather up witness statements, you're going to gather up pictures, videos. If you have experts and need experts, then you're going to go get experts that kind of help you tell the story. Was it a trucking company? Did they have a bunch of safety violations? Were they violating the DOT regulations? Can you prove that they were working over their hours of service? All of those things we'll go and look at and kind of pull together all this information to help the jury get the full picture of what's going on and why it's not just a one-off, right? Like it's a habitual violation of safety standards. So they really understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. And so then you kind of put all that together and they kind of understand, and that's what the liability side is. And then when you look at damages, you do the same thing. You look at what the current medical records are. You talk to, various medical professionals and doctors. You hire experts to kind of describe for the jury, what the injury is and how it will impact their life. You can do illustrations and mock-ups of what a surgery will look like. So when you talk about, having back surgery, not just telling them that they had back surgery, but showing the x-rays with the instrumentation and the screws and everything else that goes along with it, and showing them how it happened, showing them what they're going to need in the future, how it's going to impact their life in terms of like wages. Let's say if you have back surgery and then you were doing a heavy manual labor job and you can't go back to it, well, then you have an economist that talks about, well, okay, you can't do this job anymore. And so that's what this loss is going to be. And so you take all of that and you put it together and you then present it to the jury so that they can have a full understanding of how a person has been impacted by the careless decisions of another.
And how do insurance companies challenge that evidence presented by accident victims?
Sure. So what insurance companies do is they'll hire defense lawyers to represent their insureds. And there's a group of experts that they'll generally use who will say, from a liability standpoint, that their insured did nothing wrong. And from a damages standpoint, they go out and hire doctors that say, well, this person doesn't need surgery, or if they do need surgery, it wasn't as a result of the collision because it's a result of old age, and this is naturally occurring, even though they didn't have pain until right after the collision. And so they say a lot of unfair things. And so as a lawyer, you just have to be prepared for what they're going to say, because they get to say whatever they want. And it's our job as a lawyer for the injured person to advocate on their behalf. And so we have to then explain to the jury why what the expert is saying is wrong and is not fair. And the great thing about it is the jury system is really fair. Most people that serve on a jury, they want to be fair and they want to treat people fairly. And so when they hear things that don't make sense and have no common sense related to them, they generally will reject those ideas. So if a doctor comes in and says, well, this is just due to old age, well, then the question is then why did the pain just show up after the collision and not before? I mean, it just kind of defies common sense. And when that happens, juries are good at seeing through the ridiculousness that is presented sometimes.
So when evidence is disputed, how does that affect the likelihood of going to trial? And then what are the most powerful pieces of evidence that tend to win car accident lawsuits here in Texas?
So sure, every case that I'm involved in, the lawyers don't agree on the evidence, right? Or agree on the facts, right? I mean, some cases we might agree that a person is at fault, but we're going to disagree over damages, right? And so we have an adversarial process. And as a lawyer, my job is to present evidence. And the best evidence that you can present, whether on a liability kind of case, is, well, a video, right? The video kind of shows what exactly happened. In terms of damages, there's not really one piece of evidence that really stands out. Sometimes it's a life care plan. Sometimes it's a loved one who can come in and describe what the person meant to them and how the loss has affected them, how the injuries has affected them, right? That's what I find in damages is the most impactful, is finding somebody that can describe for the jury how this has affected a person's life. And if the person isn't the actual injured person, but one party, that's even more impactful. So oftentimes I'll bring spouses, I'll bring friends, I'll bring coworkers to describe what they've seen since the collision to help people understand how this has impacted a person's life in a bad way.
That is an incredible breakdown, Hank. Thank you so much. This has been very valuable. We have gone deep on every type of evidence that matters in a car accident case here in Houston: the police report, photographs, witnesses, medical records, expert witnesses, accident reconstruction, how it all comes together in Harris County. For someone watching this video who has been in a car accident in Houston and is trying to figure out whether they have a strong case, what is one thing you want them to remember about evidence?
The one thing that I would tell you to remember is that there's a lot of different types of evidence and different ways to prove your case. And the most important thing is to have a lawyer who knows what they're doing look at the evidence that exists and give you an opinion, which is why we offer a free consultation, right? We want people to get the facts so that they can make a good decision on how they want to proceed. And so, having somebody talk to you about your evidence and the type of evidence that exists in the case will help you make a determination as to what your rights are and what's the best way for you to proceed.
That is great advice. If you are someone watching and have been in a car accident in Houston and you're not sure whether your evidence is strong enough to pursue a claim, make that call. You can find Sutliff and Stout Injury and Accident Law Firm at sutliffstout.com or call them directly at 713-987-7111. Thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next episode of the Sutliff and Stout Legal Podcast.